in your own life as you strive for a higher road to travel. My featured guests will have their own unique stories to tell that enlighten your mind and your soul. So kick back, relax, and learn the secret to success when you take the high road.
Real friends, good friends, hard to find, let's face it.
Hey, it's Nancy Yearout, and welcome to High Road to Humanity today. And again, we have a wonderful show for you today. Today, I've got a really cool guy. His name is Frank Pascituti, and he's a PhD. He has a PhD, and he's going to talk to us about chrysalis crisis. Now, what is that? Well, it's how life's ordeals can lead to personal and spiritual transformation. And let me give you a little bit of info about Frank here. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and certified hypnotherapist. I love that. In private practice in Charlottesville, Virginia. He is founder and president of Association Clinicians of Virginia, which provides psychotherapy and organizational development services to individuals and businesses. So Dr. Pascituti is the chairman of the Institutional Review Board at the Moreau Institute in Faber, Virginia, and he collaborates on research related to NDE's psychic phenomena and the survival of consciousness at the Division of Perceptual Studies, a research unit of the Department of Psychiatry and Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Now, he's written this book, and I'll tell you what, I started to read this, and it's really interesting because he tells us how eventually we all become conscious of our spirituality. And that's what this is about. So welcome to High Road to Humanity, Frank. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome. You know, I just think this is really interesting. And I'm wondering if you would tell the story, because I thought it was pretty cool how you tell the story of your family and mostly your mom and how you got into this work. Would you mind telling the audience the story of how you decided you wanted, to get into this field?
Well, interestingly, I grew up in a family, extended Italian family in New Jersey, in Newark, New Jersey, and
Okay.
my grandfather came over from Italy, but before he did, he was kind of influenced by the spiritualist movement that was going on in the late 1800s in Europe.
Okay.
Um, and so I had an interesting blend because at the same time, my mother's family was more the family we allied with. My grandmother was a Catholic, churchgoer every day, and my so there was so part of the influence of my grandfather and another organization called the Rosicrucians, which my two of my uncles, my mother, one of my cousins joined. It's a non-sectarian mystical organization that talks about a lot of phenomena that are more like psychic experiences and
Right.
other ways of understanding, spirituality in a non-religious way. So as I was growing up in the Catholic Church, I would get other, not only the 1950s indoctrination there, but I was also getting it sort of reinterpreted to me through more mystical literature where, the miracles might have been put in terms of paranormal phenomena like.
Right. And that's unusual, especially in that time, because people didn't want to talk about this stuff so much then.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I was forewarned by my family that this is stuff you don't necessarily put out on the street. And nevertheless, I remember being in eighth grade, and when the priest would come in every Monday morning to talk to us and give us a religion class, I once raised my hand and said, "Well, what do you think about reincarnation?" And I was kind of like
Oh my
a little.
goodness.
My friends looked at me. I think I was just kind of showing off that I knew this big word or something, but I had already become familiar with that concept.
Right.
So I had always had an interest in this stuff. And then my mom, I was born to my mom, who had experienced MS back in the days, multiple sclerosis, when they thought it was Lou Gehrig's disease and thought she was going to die. And
Right.
so she went on this real strong spiritual search, try to make meaning of her life. And her father got involved, her brothers got involved. And 10 years later, she stabilized and 10 years later had children. And I came along as a second child. So I was kind of an indirect beneficiary of her search for meaning and understanding. And her father was also an early believer in mind and body kind of concepts. And then
So it
interesting.
ran in the family. So the whole thing, it really ran in the family. And she was very spiritual, as you talk about. When she got MS, she had such a great attitude. I thought that was really cool how you talk about that in the book, how her positive attitude, even though she was bedridden at one point. Yes.
Oh, well, it took her, it very much so. And so I would see her. I mean, I only knew her to be in a wheelchair, and yet I'd often hear her laughing and cracking jokes on the phone with her sisters, or laughing at TV shows, or
Oh,
whistling when she was in the kitchen doing things. So she was really an amazing person. And the last 5 years of her life, she was on her back in a hospital. Believe it or not, they let her be in a hospital for 5 years,
right.
and MS takes you out slowly. So there was a so, but nevertheless, right up until her last days, she was still cogent and still held on to her faith. And one of them was she just believed that all her experiences contributed to her soul's evolution. She believed in reincarnation. And even when I said, "Mom, if you believe in reincarnation, doesn't a part of you want to just get out of this body? It hasn't all been all that cooperative, And she said, I'm still here. I'm still listening to your life and your sister's life, and my sisters and brother come by and visit me, and so I'm still in the game. I still want to be here." And
Right.
she wasn't physically suffering, and she did. So that was a really powerful lesson for me.
Right.
Watch how that kind of crisis could be absorbed, and still watch her grow and transform. And then I think what happened for me, just to transition over here, what happened, I did explore other areas to go to school. I studied business administration and things, but one day I kind of like thought, you know what am I really interested in? And I was interested in a lot of these different phenomena. And I
Right.
thought, what field is most closely associated to this? And I made the assumption to think that psychology is. And that kind of like early in my 20s pivoted into clinical psychology, which
Right.
I've led a double life, I'll have to admit, for many of those years. I continued to keep my interest in a lot of this other stuff, kind of like on the QT for the most part, so I didn't get marginalized out of the gates.
Right. No, I'm with you. And so that's interesting because you knew you had to get into the mainstream, but you had to be careful about how you approach different things. And you've done a lot of work, and I read as much as your book as I could in this last week. It was very good. But you started to talk to different people about near-death experiences and things like that. And that came into focus, I think. And we can talk about it when we come back. I know we've got 1 minute to break. But I want you to talk about the name of the book, which is Chrysalis Crisis, and I'm going to hold it up here so people can see it. We've only got 1 minute to go. Tell people what the name means. I know what it means, but I'd like for you to tell the audience before we run to break here.
Oh, real quick, it's the idea that in the aftermath of the metamorphosis that the caterpillar goes through, and as it's trying to emancipate from the literal meltdown it went through, there's a struggle to release itself from the cocoon, and the
Right.
struggle has two purposes. One is to emancipate and free its wings. The other one is the actual struggle itself strengthens the wings for flight. So
So
I thought that the idea is coming off of a crisis. Once you get through the initial adjustment period, there's still a struggle there to make sense out of it, and it usually leads to growth in many
and we
different ways.
become a butterfly. I love it. All right, we'll be right
Hang
back.
on, we have more stories to tell on High Road to Humanity. Check out Nancy's website, Nancy Yearout.
I love that analogy because it's true. We go through things in our life, and as long as I think it's how we handle it, don't you? How we handle the crisis, because you don't feel like a butterfly right away. We're at break now, but I'm just saying, don't you
Uh,
think, Frank?
no, you're absolutely right. And actually, this is kind of like a somewhat insensitive interpretation, but we all go through our meltdowns, right? And
Yeah.
we stabilize and get grounded. As a therapist, sometimes after people get stabilized and get grounded and get through the initial adjustment, oftentimes you pivot in therapy and say, so what is it about that experience? Or you look and say, is this person having trouble
Right.
integrating through this
Right.
experience? And sometimes it implicates what you call the premorbid state. How were
Yeah.
they were functioning before the crisis?
Well, and that's what I want to talk about because everybody has death happen in their family, and sometimes it's divorce, or sometimes it's, a loss of a job. So, I'd like to address that, what you were just saying, that you do learn, and eventually, you get through the crisis, and so if you would address it, I think it would help people, because sometimes when you're in crisis, you think there's no end. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. When you're in the middle of a storm, you never know if it's going to end. All you see is dark clouds and
I know. So I think that's what one thing I'd like to talk about before we get into some of this other stuff, because I want to talk about the spiritual, some of your spiritual work and the NDEs and all that kind of stuff too. That's cool. You can tell us a couple of stories. 50. Okay, he says 15 minutes to 2. Okay, cool. What's the weather like in Charlottesville? That's where Sarah's at. Is the weather good?
pretty decent right now.
Is
Actually,
it?
it's
Okay. Well, we're
clear,
in Texas.
so much clouds.
We want to thank you so much for listening to High Road to Humanity. This is where Nancy and her guests tell stories that will guide you and enlighten your mind and soul. Now, welcome back to the High Road.
Hey, welcome back to High Road to Humanity. And I am here today with Frank Pascituti, and his book is Chrysalis Crisis. I'm holding it up. We can get this at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Is that right, Frank?
Barnes & Noble, Amazon, yes.
Cool. Hey, before we went to break, you were telling us what chrysalis crisis means, and you were saying it's like, you metamorphose from, into a butterfly, coming out of the cocoon, and you kind of use that analogy for when we go through a crisis in our own life, that eventually, once the crisis has, settled down, I guess, I don't know if the right verbiage, but then you start to see the lesson and the blessing in what happened. Can you address that? Because it's hard for people, when someone dies or you lose your job or you're going through a divorce, crisis, what do you suggest or what do you tell people about it?
Well, let me give you an example I use in the book. A fellow who I work with here in town who was a brilliant man, very cerebral, very involved with his work at the university, physicist, and his wife held down the home front with 2 kids, 2 young children, and she suddenly died. Now, he was a pretty introverted guy and liked his work, liked being in his lab, and then suddenly he was not very aware of his own feelings, and nor did he do that social interpersonal thing much or deal with the kids' feelings. And so you can imagine in the aftermath of losing his wife suddenly, he had to deal with feelings and he had to deal with his kids' feelings as part of through it. So when he came to see me, my work initially was to try to help him get stabilized and just kind of deal with the initial shock of the whole thing. And however, in his ability to try to integrate and move through the grieving process, it wasn't easy for him because he wasn't aware or registered much with his feelings of sadness. He was a great guy, and he wasn't aware of maybe his feelings of anger and fear. You might say his intellectual IQ was really high, while his emotional and social IQ were lower.
Right. Well, I read this story, and it almost seemed like, and I wanted to ask you this since you're telling the story, it almost seemed like the relationship he had with his wife was perfect because she was the one that told him how he felt.
Exactly. Well, yeah, and sometimes we can compensate in our relationships where we pick up where our strengths kind of offset the weaknesses or deficits of the other. But hopefully you'll learn from the other person and maybe incorporate those abilities.
Right.
But in his case, it happened suddenly, and so he had to adjust. And so a lot of my work, just in helping him get through the experience, was trying to help him be aware of the feelings he was having, and not just be aware of them cognitively, but be okay with feeling sad and even crying when necessary, or feeling angry that his whole life got turned upside down. And then as you get more in touch with your feelings, as you know, you can be more able to empathize with others. And so particularly with his children, being comfortable with other people expressing feelings when you're not comfortable yourself. And so that was a big awakening for him. And then also because he was so reclusive in his work, he had to grow socially. All of a sudden, he was the one who had to go to the meetings with the teachers, and he had to negotiate the babysitters and dealing with, play groups and all those things. So he really had to come out of himself. He was almost like thrown out, of himself. And so he transformed. He started changing very significantly, had to rebalance work and home life. And so he was a great example of how changing his thinking intellectually, changing his, expanding his awareness of feelings and social awareness, his identity. Many of the 10 key areas I identify in the book were on the table for him to have to expand and grow.
Right.
Powerful.
One thing I wanted you to tell us about, and I don't know if this also sparked your interest in getting into telepathy and clairvoyance and the study of all that stuff. You tell a story about your uncle, Uncle Atlo, and they called him Uncle Atlas. Can you tell that story? Because that
Well,
kind of triggered you. Is that right? Am I
yeah.
pronouncing that proper?
Well, yeah, some of the story of my uncle, who was my unmarried uncle, and well, I lived in a 16 family apartment building that my grandfather built, and so he was across the hall with another unmarried brother and my grandmother and my grandfather, and so we were like clearly in this nest of a lot of extended family, and so he had an experience in the war where, he was coming back over enemy lines, and he was kind of a leader, man's man. He was a strong guy and not wishy-washy at all. But he had a really strong premonition that where they were going to settle one night did not feel safe to him. And so his fellow, you know, soldiers kind of thought, why is Addles having a problem with this? He's usually like the go-to guy, but he just could not get comfortable. He just felt something bad was going to happen and persisted. And so eventually, they checked him out, thought maybe he had battle fatigue, which is what they called
Right.
PTSD in those days. And
Yeah.
so, long story short, they had come over from enemy lines. They actually backtracked into enemy lines and found another, at least suitable place for the night. And during the night, mortar was going on, lots of bombing and stuff. They decided to get up and get out early. And they did. When they backtracked over where they had gone by that spot the night before, the place was completely blown up. They would have all died.
Oh, yeah.
He had his own experience with what felt to him like a premonition. And that also, you have to realize he's his father, my mother's father. They
Right.
already had talked about these things as possibilities, precognition, and but he wanted to learn more about it, and that's what took him into exploring organizations like the Rosicrucians and also other organizations. Edgar Casey's work
Right.
was pretty popular, but not only that, he also got into the literature a bit and drew my mother in, and so
I
those
see.
were influences in my family
So
that
when
I
you
was.
got into your work, I mean, when was you tell a story in the book, you start to see patients in your practice, and then you start to have people who have had near death experiences. You talk about a man who had a heart
Well,
attack. And did that kind of,
yeah,
once you start to see patients, then you start to hear this from them, and then it starts to all come together, is what I thought.
well, you're right about that story, but it started earlier. It was actually in my doctoral program. I was at Michigan State University, and I was an intern, and we had a big staff of about 60 people, and everybody was assigned having to do intakes, and then if they couldn't pick the person up, they'd present it before the staff, and anybody who had openings would. They
Okay.
presented this young man who came in, and he seemed to the intake person to be psychotic. He had said he thought he was the angel of death, and that
Ah,
does sound crazy, right? So
right.
and then they said, so this is 1977, 79, somewhere around there, and the intake person also said he sort of said he had something like a near-death experience the summer before. And I had already been reading about this. I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I read this other Rosicrucian material. And right before that, the book Life After Life was a bestseller written by a fellow from Charlottesville, Raymond Moody. And I realized that I thought, let me pick this guy up because he's interesting to me. Now, here I have an opportunity to work with somebody who's having what might be considered a non-conventional problem, and I'm going to get supervision. It was a little scary, so I picked him up, and I found that when he first came, the year before I started that program, I actually lived in a house as a clinician working with schizophrenics. So I almost had a visceral sense of somebody who was schizophrenic, and I didn't get
Right.
that.
So you knew maybe he wasn't schizophrenic.
It only took me about a session to realize the way he was talking, he was frightened, but he had what he called experiences of premonitions. One of them,
Okay.
which was very popular at the time, was he had a dream that the body of who was then the prime minister of Italy, Aldo Moro, who was kidnapped, was found dead in the trunk of a car, shared it with his roommate, and lo and behold, a couple of days later, that very information came out. He had also had
Wow.
a he had also had a couple of premonitions about people in his family dying, and they did indeed die. Now,
Okay.
the interesting thing was I did not know this at the time, but the research since then has shown that people who have near-death experiences tend to have increased capacity for what you might call psychic faculties. It's almost
Okay.
like near-death experience loosens the tether between
Yeah.
mind's awareness and its attachment to physicality.
Yeah.
So my colleague now and friend here at the University of Virginia, Bruce Grayson, I did not know, but he was only 85 miles down the road at the University of Michigan. I wish I knew that. I would have
How
gone to him
funny.
for supervision. But in either case, my two supervisors both were amazing with me, my group supervisor and my individual supervisor. And I shared with them, not only was I interested in all this stuff, but I was interested in reincarnation and all these things. And they said, well, you need to get down to Charlottesville, Virginia. There's a department down there run by this man, Ian Stevenson. They explore all these things, near-death experiences, mediumship, and reincarnation. And so that set the tone for me to start looking towards Charlottesville as a possible place to go to after I finished my doctorate.
Nice.
And I also presented that case to my intern. I put together the most challenging group of senior clinicians before I did my intern presentation and said, hey, save me from myself if I'm totally out to lunch here. And mostly got a lot of encouragement from people. They said, hey, you just got to get in there and you got to find support and trust yourself. And I felt really encouraged by that.
Right.
So that's kind of bridging both of the conventional kinds of problems and what you might consider the non-conventional problems.
Yeah. Well, and once you started so then you moved to Charlottesville and started a practice there, or you moved there and got involved in the program that is there?
Well, mostly I came here, and interestingly, it took me, I came down here, I made a little pilgrimage back about 2 years before I moved here. And as the universe would have it, 2 years later, I met a woman who's been my wife for 39 years. And,
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
she ended up getting 2 job offers. One was in Detroit, Michigan, which at a clinic that I was familiar with, a psychiatric clinic. And she said, I got this other job at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Never been there, never heard of it. And I said, well, I have.
That's
So
crazy.
that also became a major
Well,
attraction to Charlottesville.
right, right. I'm from Michigan, by the way. FYI. I don't think I don't say that very often, but yeah, I went to school in Michigan. So because of all these experiences that you've had in your clinical experiences, when somebody comes in now and says, "Hey, I had a near-death experience," how do you deal with it? I mean, what do you do? Does it take a while, or talk to us about that?
Well, it's interesting in that a lot of people have what you might call these anomalous or paranormal experiences.
Oh, we got about 30 seconds to go. They're telling me here. So we're going to have to talk about the near-death experiences when we come back. Hey, you guys, we're here with Frank Pascituti, and his book is Chrysalis Crisis. And if you're watching me on video, I'm holding it up right now. And just so y'all know, I'm going to do some psychic readings next week. If y'all want to call in, the number is 903-787-5887. I'm getting that in real quick before we go to break. So in case you guys want to call next week, jot it down, 903-787-5887.
We will be right back on High Road to Humanity, but make sure that you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, iHeartRadio, or download directly from Nancy's website, nancyyearout.com, so you never miss an episode of The High Road.
TogiNet Radio has partnered with one of the largest travel booking engines in the world to offer savings. There you go. I like my commercials, but now, are you intuitive like I am, Frank, at this point?
Intuitive, yeah, I was strong intuitor. I got from the earliest days in my training, I took the Myers-Briggs, and my mentor said, man, you are like on the far end of the extreme on intuition and extroversion. And
Cool.
I ended up working for 4 years, earning my in-state tuition and a stipend every month doing Myers-Briggs interpretations for a campus of 45,000 students, faculty, administrators, Michigan Bar, you name it. I was Mr. Myers-Briggs in those days.
Well, so you did readings, right?
Well, I don't do that. I actually
What do you do exactly? See, we'll talk about that. What do you do?
I work largely as a conventional psychotherapist, clinical psychologist, but I guess as a therapist, I do work a lot with dreams, and I work in a manner where I would say I pick up on images, and I was trained early on that any images that come to mind or any impressions that I may receive. I don't consider myself a psychic, but I do think I tend to work a little differently as far as therapists go. But the people who come to see me who bring in things like NDEs, a lot of that has to do with my affiliation with these two organizations, a
Mm-hmm.
couple of organizations that know that I'm a therapist who's open to alternative considerations besides just thinking that any of these phenomena these people experiences are forms of pathology. And
Well,
I,
yeah,
you know, I,
I want to talk about that a little bit too when we come back because, not that long ago, you had these kind of visions or you had dreams and people thought you were crazy. So let's talk about that real quick when we come back. I think it's really cool that you do this work.
do so.
I thought I was closer.
We want to thank you so much for listening to High Road to Humanity. This is where Nancy and her guests tell stories that will guide you and enlighten your mind and soul. Now, welcome back to the High Road.
Hey, welcome back to High Road to Humanity. And this is Nancy Yearout, your host. And hey, really quick, I want to mention one of our sponsors. It's called bestradiotravel.com. And if you go to bestradiotravel.com/Nancy, you will get really good rates on hotels. So guys, check it out. bestradiotravel.com/Nancy. And we're back with Frank Pascituti, I'm sorry, and he is in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we are just talking about NDEs. And I was asking him if he was intuitive, and he is intuitive, and he said that he is, I guess, referred a lot of patients. Is that right, Frank? Who have had dreams or near-death experiences because of the work that you do. You're not judgmental, I guess, is a word for it. Yes.
Well, yeah, I think that there's always a cost. People are always cautious to tell a therapist that they've had experiences that the majority of the world don't believe are valid and are always afraid. But when they get frightened enough, they have what we call a spiritual emergency. And that was a name that Stan Grof, who's considered the father of transpersonal psychology, gave for people who have experiences that fall outside the realm of what might be considered normal, but they're not abnormal. And that's one of the distinguishing ways I look at it and articulate it in my book, that there's what's normal. It's not necessarily normal because they are pretty extreme and outliers, but they're not outliers on the other end, which would be abnormal. And even paranormal, the word itself means alongside of. So I put them on a continuum. I, of course, do check and see whether I'm dealing with somebody who's delusional, fraudulent, psychotic, hallucinating, whatever. I mean, I have the abilities from my conventional training to rule out. But when they are actually having an experience, many times they're frightened by it because it's so foreign that
Right.
they need information. And so I'll point them into there's a lot of information out there that's
Yeah.
been accumulated over the past 125 years about phenomena that are legitimate and have been, statistically proven beyond chance, and that, however, it's so foreign to our understanding of time and space, or sense of actuality of spirit that they think that they're losing their mind and they may not be
Yeah.
able to.
Right, right. Well, no, because I have those experiences too, but I know I'm quite sane. But I, like you, had experience with my
Good.
family. Yeah, my grandma was really into it and always was into Edgar Casey and all of that. And so I was always interested, as you were as a child, about this kind of stuff, and always really wanted to know more about it. And then, of course, became more intuitive as time went on. And you talk about as people start to open up spiritually and have these experiences, you talk about psychic openings, but you also talk about something called Kundalini energy. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I don't know a ton about it, but I hear about it. Can you tell the audience what that is?
Well, there's an understanding, particularly coming from the East, that we actually have an energy inside our bodies that is that moves through us, and we have these chakras that are within us, and that as that energy moves through, it awakens these different areas. And these centers are the root center, which can both activate the sexual energy, but also activate spiritual or activate creative energy, moves up and through other chakras, the heart center, the center around speech and expression, and then the higher centers, the psychic centers. So that's been around for, I think, that understanding since the days of Pantajali, who's the father of yoga 4,000 years ago. And out of that, train of thinking, Buddhism arose. So there is,
Hmm.
but when people actually have these experiences, they're frightened by them because they're very physical, and they start worrying about that. Of course, we want to always rule out conventional explanations, because if you're having different things, I often tell people, well, let's get yourself a CT scan or an MRI or an fMRI and do all the things we know that Western science is quite capable of doing. But oftentimes it's hard. These are elusive. It's sort of like the meridians in acupuncture. You have a sense that
Hmm.
this energy exists, and people work with it, but it doesn't lend itself to our typical forms of measurement. And so unless you
Well,
experience it, it's
yeah,
hard to
unless you
calculate.
experience it. Well, and don't you feel like I feel like that more and more people are talking about these things, about dreams and about premonitions and using their abilities. And you hear so many people talk about raising the consciousness now.
I agree. I mean, I think about just in the earliest days when I was getting in the field, meditation was kind of radical. Doing yoga was kind of like not
Yeah.
really all that popular. I remember starting that. I remember thinking about, I was on a track team in college, and I remember when I read my first book on yoga back in the early 70s, I thought, well, this is similar to the stretching we did before we worked out. And then I was reading how people will do yoga as a lead entree into meditating, sort of stretch the body, get yourself in a centered space, and then
Right.
meditate. And so now it's very popular. And I also think as meditation gets more popular and people drop into these states of consciousness that are conducive for those very subtle impressions of a psychic nature to cross the threshold of awareness, more of that is going to be happening. And
Right.
that's when people get frightened and have these spiritual emergencies, and they start wondering, well, how did I know that? Or where did that come from? And even dream work.
Mhm.
People, if you don't pay attention, just like if you don't pay attention, if you don't believe these things, sometimes you can actually, or if they frighten you, you can inhibit your ability to register them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and our society has, pushed this whole thing down. And it's nice to see that it is coming back and it's okay to be intuitive and it's okay to know things. It doesn't make you weird and nobody wants to put you away because, maybe you had a near death experience and now you can talk to the dead. So, I think it's really great that you do this work. And I think you've probably helped a lot of people realize that they're not crazy, but maybe you help them with their spiritual growth. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, and the idea behind the book is to say that we have a lot of these, I break it out into 10 keys, but we have a lot of these dimensions or capacities, which I consider all capacities or energies of consciousness, and those that are typically harnessed or manifest in a physical or human range of functioning. Consciousness expresses itself throughout the whole universe, and so you have. So what I'm trying to say in the book is, hey, as much as you're a physical being, an emotional being, an intellectual being, you're having to struggle with your sense of identity, your capacity to be intimate, asking existential questions like meaning and purpose in life. You also have these intuitive faculties and direct spirit capacity to
Mhm.
experience spirit directly, not just in
Right.
terms of religion, but more about people have the capacity to be aware outside their bodies. Near-death experiencers have shown us that people have out of body experiences. People behold what they believe are the spirits of the deceased. Now, are they all hallucinating? Some of them are, but are every one of them? Like William James, the father of American psychology, who's well known, once said, "Hey, all you need is one white crow to prove that all, that not all crows are black." So,
Right.
these experiences may be less frequent, but another one of his colleagues, Frederick Myers, with whom he started the whole psychics association coming out of Europe, he once said that, many of these, what he called supernormal capacities of consciousness, like psychic abilities or the ability to be outside your body, have awareness outside the physical body. He said there will be a day in human evolution where they may be more normal or not,
Right.
or pulled more into the range where more and more people will have these experiences. They'll be less frightening, and maybe as we hopefully evolve as a species, these will become faculties
Right.
that may even serve us.
Right. I did a reading for a young lady last week, and she said, I've been journaling and I've been meditating, and now I know things. And I said, yes, you do. Because the more you meditate, you're getting the energy from above. And the more you journal, you're releasing what you're feeling and what you're thinking. And those are two things that really enhance somebody's psychic abilities. And you talk about that in your book about meditation and journaling. And it just seems to be almost like the basics. If you meditate and you journal and you believe, then you've got a whole different world to look into, don't you think?
I agree, and there's some great research by a woman psychologist years ago who's passed away, Gertrude Schmeidler, and she did some research called the sheep goat effect, and found that particularly with regards to psychic capacities, people who believed that it's possible or believed that they could possibly have psychic abilities did significantly better statistically on psychic testing than those who didn't. And people who were strong disbelievers, and this is fascinating, those who were strong disbelievers were significantly lower in their ability to hit on various psychic abilities. So it showed how their mind and their belief affected the outcome on a very controlled psychic test like card guessing or dice throwing or things like that, where they
Right.
25% maybe would be the range where the people who were strong believers that it's possible actually did
Right.
increase statistically high, or the ones who were strong disbelievers and skeptics, interestingly, they called it psi missing. They missed significantly lower.
Right, right. Well, and I call it faith, because when you have, and that's where faith comes in, which is nothing new. So when you have faith in yourself and faith in your own abilities, then, the more faith you have, then the more it like snowballs, oh, wow, that really works. It's interesting when you talk about faith, and we had Joe Gallenberger on the show last week, and he talks about Vegas. I was thinking when you were talking about rolling the dice, inner Vegas, and he's been able to go to Vegas and prove that if you are happy and have a certain frame of mind, that you'll win. And that's been his experiment. And I just think it just exactly what you're saying. If you believe and believe in yourself and you have faith and faith in a higher power, it changes your life completely. That's what I've learned. We're about 7 seconds to break here, you guys. We're here with Frank Pascituti, and his book is called Chrysalis Crisis. You can pick it up at Amazon.
We'll be right back with the High Road and more. Don't forget to visit Nancy's website.
I love all this stuff, Frank. Let's talk about
with people who are open.
What?
No, I like talking to people who are open to it too.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. Well, because I always learn. I always tell everybody, every show I do, I know the audience learns, and our audience is really growing, and I learn. And it's really cool because each person I meet, I learn something more from, and it's been really, really interesting. I want to talk about reincarnation on the last segment. What do you want to talk about?
That's fine.
Anything in particular?
It's a foundational. Well, it's fine. I talking about reincarnation enables me to open up and talk about our evolution over lifetimes, and what is it that we're actually. What is it? What are the areas where we need to grow so we can increase our spiritual selves?
Right. And that's what I think. See, I believe that too. I believe we're here and we're learning, and it's up to us, and we either learn or we don't. I can only help the people who want to be helped. I've learned that. There's a lot of people who don't want to be helped. They're happy in their little life the way they are. But there's a lot of people out there who want answers, and that's so it's been interesting. Yeah. Because sometimes you say, "Oh, I can help that person," but they don't really want it. So they have to be a willing participant. I see that sometimes too.
Readiness. When the student is ready, the teacher will arrive,
Oh,
right?
yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. What do you think, Ben? You like our show?
I do, and it really resonated with me what you just said. You can only help those who want to be helped.
Well, yeah. Yeah, you got to be open to it. But if you can open it, why did that resonate with you?
I don't know. My wife wants to help people, but she wants to force the help rather than
Let it come.
yeah. But we've got 5 seconds before we go back.
Okay, fine. All right then. back to the show. It's our last segment. And Frank, thanks so much.
We want to thank you so much for listening to High Road to Humanity. This is where Nancy and her guests tell stories that will guide you and enlighten your mind and soul. Now welcome back to the High Road.
Hey, welcome back to High Road to Humanity, and this is Nancy Yearout, your host. We're here today with Frank Pascituti, and we are talking about chrysalis crisis, meaning things that happen in your life that transform you spiritually. And on this last segment, I was wondering if Frank would talk to us about reincarnation, and I bring it up because I have people around me still that don't believe in reincarnation. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. What do you think we're doing here? But would you address your feelings on reincarnation? Let's talk about it. What do you think, Frank?
Well, I think there's sufficient evidence. One of the things that drew me to Charlottesville is that what the department here at the University of Virginia has about 3,000 cases of children who produce information that has pointed towards past lives where they're remembering things. So there's a lot of and there's explanations for how mind and memory can move across the threshold of physicality and return. And this is something that's been around. Plato talked about it, and long before him, other philosophers or other spiritual paths have
Talked about it. Hey, can I interrupt you a second? You told a story in the book. I was looking at my notes here, and what is the story about the little boy? And he wasn't his last name Houston. Why am I thinking that? And his father took him to the museum, and he was like 22 months old, and then he remembered his past life. Would you mind telling that story real quick? Because I think it's really interesting.
Sure. It's my colleague who's the director of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia interviewed him. It's interesting in that many of the cases of the kids who seem to bring these memories back at an age where they're open to those impressions, and it's not magical thinking. It's just that they're in a sort of a brainwave state, if you will, that's conducive to bringing these memories over.
Right.
This child, he was just, he just was impressed by these planes, and he went to a museum and he started talking to his parents about, the name of the plane, and it turns out that he could tell, he'd come up with the name of a ship, and all these things were just coming out of the blue. Even his parents didn't believe in reincarnation, by the way, but yet he was kind of agitated at times, like he would play with this. They bought him a little toy plane, and then he started like crashing it into the table, and he would start saying things like little boy, little man, crash. And so much information came out of him that they were able to actually identify the name of the boat. And the father did some research, found out that it was called the Natoma Bay, and that this boat was a ship that launched planes. And in the Second World War, they ultimately found that this boy was able to identify the name of the person who he was in the Second World War, who died in a plane crash. And even at the point he did, he was able to, even in this life, he was able to help them identify his sister, who was still alive, and other people who were on that boat. So it's a great book by Jim Tucker. I'm trying to think of the name of it right now.
No, the story really hit me. I was like, wow, and I've heard these stories before, but it was pretty in depth because he was able, like you say, to tell who he was. And I didn't catch the part where he knew his sister. Did he ever meet her or anything like that?
No, I don't know for sure about that, but I know it caused a lot of angst on the part of his family. And again, think about this. If you're like a parent, wonders why your kid's having these what nightmares, they look like, they're different from night terrors. And then the kid starts talking about different things. And there's a window there. There's kind of a window where that information is more able than readily able to come over into awareness. And then sometimes culturally or just in terms of the aging process, it's harder to access. And so the researcher, Ian Stevenson, who started the program here at UVA, and his colleague, they said that they trust more what's emitted and not actually unearthed by a past life therapist. Although I've been trained in past life therapy, and I do believe that in certain cases, one can be put in an altered state, particularly if one is ripe and needs the information, that some of that
Okay.
information can be brought over. And people experience real significant therapeutic change sometimes by doing past life therapy.
Right.
But it's always difficult to say, are they making this up? Is it like creating a dream? Is it enabling them to get insight and emote in ways that they need? But they at the University of Virginia, they just mostly just research cases where parents are witnessing children bringing up information, and then they work really hard in control to verify that information. Then when they do, then they say if there's no all the things that you could possibly rule out are ruled out, they usually say it's kind of a solved case and you're just going to have to accept it for what it is.
Yeah.
And
Now, what is the age group? I know this young boy was 22 months old. It seems like, what is the age where kids start to forget? Because, you hear kids say these things when they're maybe up till they're about 3 or 4, and then it kind of seems to drift away. Is that right? That's just what I think.
it does, and yet there are some cases where, as younger adults, for instance, in trance and maybe, see, if you were to put an EEG on somebody, you would say, like, what is the state of mind that, or state of consciousness that someone might be in? Like, there are people who will have what they call breakthroughs that lead to spiritual emergencies when they're meditating. Sometimes they're
Okay.
so, it's this information is if you will comes from a spirit dimension, and it's very subtle, and one needs to get one's ego out of the way, because I remember Dr. Stevenson when I first came down to see him, because we're in Thomas Jefferson's territory. He'd say, oh, I've had about 20 people come down here and tell me they think they used to be Thomas Jefferson. And if that, so that's kind of like
So the
ego
ego
work.
gets in the way. But ego gets in the way of all this spiritual work that we do.
Well, it's certainly, if you look at the way mind distills down spirit, I think of spirit as being out there in many dimensions, as all part of consciousness. Mind is almost working like the negative and positive currents of electricity. One side of it is physicality and ego, and the other side of it is more transpersonal, beyond the personal, and subtle. And so the more we are able to quiet physicality in our lives. So, like when you meditate, you quiet that, or you quiet emotions, or you're not distracted by a guilty conscience, or you have a sense of yourself as having the capacity to be
Right.
able to these dimensions. When all those other keys that I talk about in the beginning of the book are used at a higher octave, if you will, to serve spirit, these impressions become more likely to be experienced. And when you
Okay.
start experiencing them, that's when it almost starts a snowball effect. If I had a
Yes.
freak out, I think, oh, wow, how did I know that information? It hasn't even
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
And so you start seeing where belief, but also experience, then starts having an effect where you're more likely to open and maybe, like you said earlier, don't forget, in Carl Jung's frame of mind and the psychological type theory, you have two ways of being perceiving. You have the sensing, which is very objective senses, tangibly oriented physicality, and you have the
Hmm.
intuitive. And the
Right.
intuitive, it's more indirect. It comes through images and impressions and by way of the unconscious. And so do a lot of these other psychic capacities. They
Right.
come that channel in a way.
So when we talk, let's get back to reincarnation a little bit too. I believe, and I want to hear your belief. I believe we come here to learn, and we keep coming and learning until we get it right. Because we can't. We need to experience it in a body to get the lesson. Is what I feel. What's your feeling on this? Why do we reincarnate?
I agree. I think we're here to evolve and grow in all those key areas I identify. And I think as we evolve and grow, um, like Teilhard de Chardin talked about, we're always in the process of becoming. So even our traumas and our crises may open us and awaken us to areas that need to be developed. And as we gain more and more mastery, I think it's not like you got to jump up to the top of the spiritual mountain and become Jesus Christ immediately. It's more about
Right.
the higher you go, the more you expand your range of consciousness, the more joy and bliss and happiness you feel. So there's a payoff. There's a meritorious payoff.
I agree with that because the more spiritual I've become, the more joyous I've become, and the more compassionate too. I used to not be as compassionate, but the more spiritual you become and the more intuitive you become, I think then you're compassionate towards people. You're not angry at people. You see the lesson and you see the bigger picture, maybe.
I agree. I agree because compassion. It's same with even being a therapist has been a wonderful opportunity for me to say these things would have bothered me earlier in my life, but now I believe as a therapist, it all can be understood. And as you understand that, hey, we're tripping over our humanity all the time. We're all imperfect and making mistakes, but if we can learn from them and evolve and grow and expand our range of consciousnesses, inevitably we learn to feel more, we have more compassion and empathy for others, more
Right.
understanding, we see things that aren't just random and arbitrary, and we
There's a
start,
reason. There's a reason
yeah,
behind it. Yeah. Well, and
yes,
it's
and
nice that
even
you
if
do
it's
this
not,
work. It's not
uh,
what, I'm sorry.
I know, I've said I feel very blessed to be able to have the opportunity to do it, believe me.
Yeah, no, I do. You guys, his book is called Chrysalis Crisis. It's really interesting. There's lots of really cool stories in here. We've got a couple minutes before we're going to leave you today, but I want to thank you because the work you're doing is helping people. And the more we get out and talk about it, see, you and I are a little bit older, and I'm not going to age myself, but we're a little bit older, but I would have loved to have learned more when I was younger, but like you say, when we talked in the beginning of the show, it wasn't so accepted. It seems like if we can get our younger people more involved in the intuitiveness and connecting with the divine and realizing why we're here, I think it can make a big difference for everybody. It'll change like the whole generational thing. What do you think about that?
I agree. And as I wrote this book, I thought, well, I'm getting up there. My friend reminded me, I said, I'm in my sixth decade. He says, no, you're not. You're in your seventh decade because you're in your late 60s. I said, well, thanks for clarifying that for me. But I have a grandchild and a
Yeah,
couple more that are coming down the pike. So
yeah,
I often think to myself, well, you know what, before I check out, don't know how many years I have left, but I want to at least pass along because I do feel like, your perception and understanding of the bigger picture. I mean, to at least understand the forest of what we're doing
right,
here in the forest,
right,
big picture, then you can go back to dealing with each tree, right?
right. Well, listen, I just want to thank you for being on the show today. Hey, you guys, next week we've got Servet Hassan here, and it's going to be a fun show. And I really appreciate you guys visiting us today on the High Road. You can, if you want a psychic reading, visit my website. It's nancyyearout.com. If you want to pick up Frank Pasciuto's book, Chrysalis Crisis, go to Amazon or go to Barnes and Noble. And you guys, until next week, we really appreciate you guys coming on. Oh, and one more thing. If you're interested, and I need to say this one more time, I'm going to do some psychic readings next week on the show. So the number is 903-787 on High Road for more stories filled with wisdom, love, and hope for our future. To sign up for my intuitive life coaching thank you, Ben. Thank you, Frank. I hope you come back again.
Thank you, Nancy. Invite me back. It was lovely to talk with you. I enjoyed
You
it.
too. Thank you. You too. Ben, thanks for all you do. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. It was fun.
All right. Have fun. Have a good day.
Y'all be good.
Ben,
Bye.
All right. Bye.
okay, sign. See y'all.